How is second-wave feminist icon Catherine MacKinnon connected to Canadian law, to modern campus feminism, and to the active erosion of democracy? The answers might surprise you. When MacKinnon, or Dworkin, or Salinas, or any of their comrades are mentioned, so-called current feminists will scoff and cultivate the idea that those old second-wavers are irrelevant dinosaurs. The following is an excerpt of the ongoing discussions between myself, John Hemling, and my co-founder of Community Organized Compassion and Kindness, Diana Davison. Today, we're exploring the little-understood fact that the most important and effective feminist activists do not operate in the open. This is where we connect the players in their game of shady social engineering, and these are outtakes from The Edge.
Well, Catherine MacKinnon, affectionately called Kitty by her father, who was also a lawyer. So Kitty, she and Dworkin were kind of like the most prominent, no, I can't say I'm an expert.
No, they were not the most prominent, but they are big names of second-wave feminism. The problem is now, if you raise their name in any conversation, and you in front of a feminist, they go, oh, pfft, those fucking radicals, those have nothing to do with modern feminism.
We don't want to talk about what they did, because they're ridiculous, but they were like ancient, dinosaurs.
Yeah, the problem is, when anybody who says that is what we call the public clown feminists, or Twitter feminists, like Valenti, Marcotti, what's that one? But Friedman, she's a Twitter feminist. And people think that that's the activist arm of feminism. It's not. That's the clown face of feminism. What's really going on is legal activism, groups like LEAF, groups like the Elizabeth Fry Societies.
Yeah, they intervene on court cases. They have installed substantive equality into, this is what Canada has signed on to now for our version of equality, our official Canadian version of equality. Well, no, the courts have made judgments saying that substantive equality is a good model. This is not a decision made by politicians in Canada.
No, it's made by fiat, by people who are not accountable to the Canadian public.
No, it's the decisions of the Supreme Court judges that have, stated that substantive equality is their goal.
But what exactly is substantive equality? It's a phrase which appears frequently on the website of LEAF, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. So I phoned LEAF. In fact, I spoke to their education manager, Chrissy Arnold, and I asked her, what does the word substantive change about the word equality? Her answer was as follows.
It's basically like it's the kind of equality that Canada has signed on to. And what it means is like a formal definition of equality would mean that everybody gets the same thing. And substantive equality has to take into account historic patterns of discrimination, and seek to allow the law to benefit everybody equally. So it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to get the same thing, if that makes sense. But that they'll. So
it's sort of like applying quotas or a handicap to certain groups. Sort of like it's a legal golf handicap, is what it is.
In a sense, yeah, you could call it that. Yeah.
So LEAF's definition of equality, which is to say substantive equality, takes into account historical patterns of discrimination, whatever those are, and results in not everybody getting the same thing. Well, that's not equality, that's the opposite of equality. But let's return to the discussion between myself and Diana Davison.
The courts have made judgments saying that substantive equality is a good model. This is not a decision made by politicians in Canada.
No, it's made by fiat, by people who are not accountable to the Canadian public.
No, it's the decisions of the Supreme Court judges that have, stated that substantive equality is their goal. And they're all being informed by groups like LEAF, which are feminist groups. So this is the Feminist Vision, no longer seeking political approval, but trying to get the court systems to slowly, as Leaf says, one case at a time, instill the feminist vision into the fabric of society.
It's like that conversation I had with the West Coast Leaf organization on the phone yesterday. They told me that in order to even mention Leaf, I required their permission.
You know, it's funny because their entire point of existence is legal work, right? So,
well, let's talk about interveners.
Okay, well, let's get back to why we were talking about MacKinnon.
Right.
First of all, so MacKinnon, they laugh off because a lot of these Twitter feminists are sex positive, you know, and that's not something we want to get into right now. And Dworkin and MacKinnon were sex negative. They were mostly known for fighting pornography, right, and being anti-sex and almost anti-heterosexual. So they laugh about her and stuff, but the actual activism that's going on is shallow on the Twitter feminists, but it's very serious on the level of organizations like Leaf. And Catherine MacKinnon was a prominent founding member of Leaf. Leaf is a Canadian organization. She came up from the States to work with them, to guide them, and to help them set up, their form of activism that they do through the court system. And that is all they do. They don't. They do some educational stuff. They'll go around and really just them trying to educate people to breed more lawyers to, assist their organization. They actually recruit help from universities through the feminist, legal educators like Elizabeth Sheehy, where they get her students to do work on their cases for them for free.
Yeah, it's like a free internship for a feminist law student to go do a summer of articling for Leaf or whatever. And they are not a law firm in the sense of representing clients. They're just a political organization using the law to change the way society works.
And in fact, they've said that too, that they don't want people approaching them to provide legal help. They basically want people to offer their cases as, will you intervene in my case because I think it's important to what you're doing. And if it has to do with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, they will usually say, yes, we're interested.
Yeah.
Right? But they're not actually this person's lawyer. They're just a support group who goes in and intervenes usually in the final level, of the appeal.
But let's talk about intervention, because before I heard about this, I would have said this was absurd. Well, I still say it's absurd that a third-party political activist organization can inject themselves into a criminal trial and affect the outcome of that trial simply because they have influence and money. Or two people have a criminal grievance with one another. Along comes Leaf with their deep pockets and their lots of lawyers and says, "Oh, I'm an expert. The outcome should be as follows."
They have to apply for permission to intervene, and they state the reasons why the case is of interest to them.
But I don't know. I can see why the plaintiff or the defendant might want intervention, because they're there to win. I don't know why the court allows it.
Well, the court takes the position that interest groups, special interest groups, like the feminist legal groups, know more about women's lives than the court does, and so they allow them to basically educate the court as to, they're saying, well, there's certain specific aspects to this case that the judges need to be aware of.
So they're literally granting them authority of a body of knowledge.
They allow them to come in and purportedly educate them.
If that's the case, then groups like ABFM are going to be a legal intervener.
Well, they ought to be, because there's nobody in these cases representing the interests and the rights of men.
Well, not just the interests and the rights of men, because I think these feminist organizations are horribly misserving women by pushing them constantly into the role of being, you're always a victim, no matter what. It was your choice, but you're a victim because patriarchy and reasons and penis.
Well, even beyond that, they're not serving the needs of society when they're going in and saying that somebody who's committed a crime, a serious crime in most cases.
Murder, for example.
Or attempted murder, soliciting
Nicole Ryan, right?
And stuff, yeah.
And Elizabeth Sheehy was acting through Leaf as an intervener in that case.
Mm-hmm. The investigation into that case actually showed that there was no flaw of the RCMP. This is one of their things, saying, oh, well, she was a beaten woman and nobody paid attention to her, the police didn't help her. They investigated and they found...
Well, she admitted during the interview with the cop she was trying to hire to kill her husband that there had been no physical violence done by him against her.
And all of the times when her former husband, when they separated, had to come into town to deal with property issues and stuff, he notified the RCMP that he was coming there so that, he would be protected as far as accusations of his presence went. All of it was done properly. He actually went out of his way to make sure that the RCMP was aware of all of his interactions. She had other disputes that were going on with her family where she tried to run over her sister with a car and stuff like that. It had nothing to do with him. So they were known people to the RCMP. When they were investigated, it was found that there were no mistakes. And in fact, the report on the investigation is worded quite funny. Like they were trying to not say some obvious things that led them to their conclusions that the RCMP had done their jobs properly. They were trying not to be insulting to the people involved and stuff. And yet still, Sheehy and Leaf continued after this investigation to say that the RCMP failed to do their job, right? Yeah. Once they set a storyline, once they come up with the narrative that works for them, it doesn't matter what the facts are. It doesn't matter how many investigations are done. And their assertions that she was beaten, there was no investigation that showed that.
Well, never mind an investigation. She, even as she tried to hire the guy, she said to the cop that she was trying to hire to kill her husband that there was no violence done by her husband.
But the inconvenient facts that don't suit their narrative disappear. And they just continue to repeat their narrative, repeat their storyline. And the repetition somehow seems to make it back.
It pushes it into sort of being something that everybody knows.
Right. And then these are the facts they bring to the judges. They just, their byline or bottom line is you always believe the woman. So to them, it was a true narrative that she was a beaten woman, and they didn't need the investigation to show it. And they're educating the court.
Battered woman. She was a battered woman.
Battered woman,
but
yes.
Let's talk about that phrase. Battered woman doesn't mean what we think it does. Like, when you say battered woman, it doesn't mean a woman who was physically assaulted. It actually has no relevance at all to any kind of reality of a physical assault or a verbal assault or torment of any kind of psychological abuse. Battered woman is simply a legal condition that exists after a series of things have been said in a court. That's all it is.
Well, the essential ingredient is that a woman claims to be afraid, right? For any reason on any level, and not even a physical fear, right? It can be psychological abuse. They've expanded it and actually tried to promote the psychological abuse and emotional abuse concepts.
Well, we're going to come back to that too.
To trump the physical abuse.
Yeah, because in many cases where there is actually no physical abuse, they still want to be able to play this card. But that's going to bite them on the ass.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is not about... Obviously, they're not serving women very well, teaching them how to be responsible adults, but they're not serving society. They're actually interfering with the court system in creating a balanced and safe society by saying that these women should be excused for doing horrid things that anybody else would be put in jail for, and yet they're perfectly safe for society. They are destabilizing society with their interference and false narratives. Like, what they claim to be helpful is a story that they've created, that they've laid on top of a case. Whether that case actually fits that narrative or story or not, they don't even care.
Well, there's enough of them that they can just say it over and over. If you write an anti-feminist narrative in the media, you are labeled a radical right-wing, woman-hating, misogynist, whatever. They will box you into this little hole and basically render your voice mute. It doesn't matter if you pro-woman or anti-woman, their little narrative will be used to silence you.
Well, it's agenda-driven in a completely different way than your Twitter feminists. You've got your legal activist feminists who are actually shaping the society on top of which these Twitter feminists sit there. And they're so full of themselves, like, we are the thing. Like, Jacqueline Friedman has a seminar she went around doing, saying, how feminism, online feminism is like the clitoris, right?
God.
And, which is, she's trying to mix her sex positive, ideas with her, her Twitter activism. But it was so vain, saying, oh, it's everywhere, we're making changes, we're doing all these great things. And they're getting a lot of attention when people, laugh about feminism or try to get into, these statements are ridiculous. They get a lot of the attention focused on them because people live online so much, right? But these people are not actually, all they're doing is controlling the dialogue on the surface.
And they're also directing attention away from where the real activism is happening. So the online clown show, these, the Rebecca Watsons and the Jacqueline Friedmans, the ridiculous idiots who say such idiotic stuff online that is so easy to take down. The problem is taking them down doesn't accomplish anything. They're not the ones changing laws. All they are is blasting this narrative out that you think that if you can countervene their narrative with logic or evidence, well, you'll return to some sense of rationality, but you won't, because behind the scenes there's this whole other layer of moneyed, deep-pocketed, politically connected activists who don't make clowns of themselves in public and draw attention.
They're the opposite. They want to stay quite invisible so nobody can see what they're doing, which is, hence why they said, we don't want you to mention LEAP without our permission.
Yeah.
They want to stay out of the public vision so that nobody's really aware of what they're doing. But there is one thing that the Twitter feminists, the clowns, are doing to help people like LEAP, and that's building some facts on the ground. So the Everyday Sexism Project.
Oh, yeah,
right?
Narrative shaping.
Mm-hmm. And also, they go online and they say ridiculous things or attack like the entire gaming community, and then they get the anger in return because they've attacked a community without actually understanding it. Like Anita Sarkeesian admitted that she doesn't like playing games because beating people up, I don't want to do that. So they're going into a community that's got its own sort of like inner group and attacking them, and of course they get like anger in response, and then it's like, oh my god, it's not anger because she's an idiot, it's anger because she's a woman. And that's a huge public event that a lot of people, you talk about Sarkeesian, everybody knows
that she got flamed by 4chan, right?
She got threatened, right?
I don't think she really got threatened. I think they were threat-oids.
Not in a way where you'd actually expect somebody who's going to show up at her house and beat the crap out of her.
No.
And the rescue, the female narrative is a common thread because nobody's going to care about rescuing a man. They'd be like, well, he can fucking save himself.
Yeah.
Right? So, it's not that, these women are put in vulnerable, help me situations because people
want to put them in peril.
Dislike women and think that they're weak. It's because nobody's going to go save a man. They're only going to go save a woman. So in the fictional framework of the game, the only way that storyline would work would be if it was a female that you're trying to rescue.
Yeah. There's so many games that you can go cherry pick ones that fit your narrative.
Well, you can tell she's not a gamer when they have the footage of her with one of the, game controls or whatever, and she's sitting there just casually like hitting a button every like few half seconds. It's obvious she doesn't know how to play just from the way she holds her. But they're creating facts on the ground. They're creating events for these other serious women who are disturbing the legal framework that we live in. They're using those, public narratives, those public events to support their cases.
You've been listening to Diana Davison, and I'm John Hembling on Outtakes from the Edge, produced by Community Organized Compassion and Kindness, which you can find online at canadiancock.org. If you'd like to support this show or the work done by Community Organized Compassion and Kindness, you can make a donation through the website or from the link in the description of this podcast. What do you call the opposite of justice? Many people would say the answer is injustice. However, what if you subscribe to a particular ideal which had goals that, when attained, would advantage you and which would be sharply destructive to just about everybody else? And to achieve these goals, you needed widespread public adoption of your goals as if they were something positive for everyone. It wouldn't be effective to speak about such destructive intentions in plain language. It would make more sense in such a case to use a different word than injustice to describe what was the opposite of justice. In fact, if the social standing of individuals or their social demographic could be used to selectively suppress their fundamental civil rights, such as the freedom to speak, and for individuals of another demographic to have their demands elevated above anyone else, you'd need some pretty manipulative rhetoric to accomplish this. How about altering the term justice by placing a positive sounding adjective in front of it, like social justice? It's a pretty neat trick. and it convinces nearly everyone who hears it that selectively suppressing or elevating people's fundamental human freedoms based on which demographic they belong to is a good, positive practice, and convincing them it's not the practice of what not so long ago we would have called apartheid. But what about another positive sounding word? This time we'll start with equality. We're talking about the legal concept where any two people are equal before and under the law. If an individual wants to exercise their right to free expression or of association, or if they commit a violent act, it won't matter what demographic they're from, whether they're white or black or heterosexual or homosexual or male or female or religious or non-religious. In a society practicing legal equality, the skin color or the sex or the sexual preference of an individual should not matter. But what if you belonged to a particular demographic and you wanted to be given an unequal advantage based on membership in your personal social class? You might start with a popular piece of modern mythology, like the phrase rule of thumb. That phrase originated in the Middle Ages when modern standardized tape measures and rulers did not exist. So, tailors, builders, and other craftsmen would use a part of their body as a measuring device. The first segment of most men's thumbs are about 1 inch long, and this became a standard way of measuring materials, such as cloth, wood, rope, and so on. However, the phrase rule of thumb, because it was so widely used, was soon applied as a shorthand reference to general guidelines in all manner of human endeavor. As a rule of thumb, most personal digital devices are USB compatible, and as a rule of thumb, I water my houseplants about every week or so. The original literal meaning of the phrase, in which 1 inch is measured using the thumb as a ruler, is mostly forgotten. Writing from a particular ideology of gender attributes a different origin to the phrase rule of thumb. It is claimed the phrase rule of thumb is inherited from the notion that men were entitled to beat their wives with sticks as long as they were no thicker than the man's thumb. If this were true, it would reflect an accepted character of brutal malevolence towards women by men through much of human history. It would indicate a naturally existing sociopathy of an entire sexual class, a class of monsters. It might even provide a modern justification to allow the killing of members of such a caste of brutal subhumans by members of the caste of those thumb-thickness bludgeoning victims. It would certainly set the tone of a historical narrative used to justify the practices of gross inequality in the present, at least for those who don't think for themselves. But even if history showed a mountain of female corpses balancing the millions of men killed in wars and in history throughout the ages, even if the phrase rule of thumb had a practice of brutality by one sex against the other as its origin, which it doesn't, unless you count the brutality of that narrative against men, it would remain utterly immoral to transfer culpability for wrongdoing by an individual in the past, long dead, onto an individual in the present who had no part in that claimed wrongdoing. Your grandfather, or maybe even your father, committed a crime. He's not around anymore, but we're all outraged at the historical misdeed. You, who were not there at the time and didn't even exist when that misdeed was committed, you're going to get in the barrel and take a beating for it. Your son, who hasn't been born yet either, we're going to put him in the barrel too and make him pay as well. Oh yeah, the crime, rule of thumb, didn't actually happen, but that's okay, it makes for good outrage. So we'll just keep repeating it until it's simply accepted as common knowledge, and we're going to call this whole scheme substantive equality. Just think of it like a golf handicap, written into the law based on the social demographic you belong to. You've been listening to Diana Davison and John Hembling, that's me, on Outtakes from the Edge, produced by Community Organized Compassion and Kindness. which you can find online at canadiancock.org. If you'd like to support the work done by Community Organized Compassion and Kindness, you can make a donation through the website or from the link in the description of this podcast. Thanks very much for listening. Have a great day.